I think I began to realise I was different quite early on. And in today's terms, it was much more about gender than sexuality. I mean, I was slight, I was fair-haired, I had a lisp, I was a classic sissy. I was sort of boy who the captains of the football teams used to toss not to have me. I was different. I recognised myself as different. But it was very much wondering, you know, if I'm not a man, what am I? If I'm not male, what am I? So my initial things were about being ashamed of being not queer, but sissy-ish, effeminate. And that was my terror for a long time. It was later, really, I suppose by the time I was about 16, 15, 16, I began to recognise there was an association between my sissiness and the possibility of being sexually different. And I began to realise that I fancied boys and I didn't fancy girls. And it was at that stage that I tried to find a language that would explain it. And I began reading my mother's advice, my mother's magazines with advice columns, and I found medical texts by my grandfather on the shelves, those sorts of things. Started looking in the library for anything which gave a sense of who I might be. So by the time I was getting ready to come to university, I had in fact already recognised myself as queer, as someone who was definitely on this side of the fence rather than the other. And I think I was beginning to feel comfortable in being different. For a long time, I went through a religious phase, and for a long time I used to pray that I wouldn't be queer, that I'd be normal. By the time I was preparing for university, I stopped praying, and I recognised what I was. That left lots of questions open. How I was going to live with what I was, what sort of a life I was going to lead, how I was going to tell my family about it, my parents, my brothers, and so on. So there were all sorts of doubts and anxieties, but I no longer had any doubt or anxiety about who or what I was. By the time I came to London, I knew I was queer. And London was an adventure, in part, to find out what that meant. Well, funnily enough, I came to terms with being gay, although I called it queer then, and everyone called it queer then, and that was way before, a year before I came to university. But of course I never told a soul. It was something that was entirely internal, and I thought I could never divulge it to anyone. One of the attractions of London was that it was large, anonymous. I'd visited a number of times on family holidays, and I thought at least I'd be freer to explore whatever gayness meant at that time. I hoped UCL would be a beacon of liberalism and light, and in many ways it was, but not about sexuality at that period. The 60s was still very hung up about sexuality, and although it was supposed to be the swinging 60s, only a very few people swung. And when you think of some of the great stars of the period as we now see them, they had to flee to America to feel absolutely free. So there were lots of restrictions in London. And although UCL was welcoming it in many ways, it wasn't particularly anxious to allow you to talk about sexuality or express your sexuality. So whatever I did was outside the university, outside the college. Well, of course, what I hoped for when I came to UCL was I would meet lots of other people like myself. And for a long time I didn't. I did actually, in my very first term, fall hopelessly in love with a fellow student. And it was the first time I'd experienced love as opposed to basic sex. And for the first term we did everything together. But then I think he began to suspect that I had designs on him. And he cut me off, basically. And that was the end of the intimate friendship. We'd meet each other at lectures and nod at each other, but the intimacy had gone. And of course, he lived a straight life thereafter. I've since met him a couple of times and wondered, in all honesty, what I found attractive in him. But there was a long time between then and now. Well, I honed in on one guy who was quite camp, and I thought he must be. We went walking through Soho several times together, actually. He was very interested in the strip clubs and so on. So I tagged along with him out of interest. I had no idea that there was gay stuff going on in Soho at that stage. But I did take the opportunity to come out to him. And he looked horrified and denied vehemently that he was queer. And in fact, he maintained that for another 10 years, although I harboured suspicion. And then he came out to me and to large numbers of other people. And he's been a gay activist ever since, over 40 years of it. But at the crucial stage, when I needed support, needed people like myself, he wasn't there and no one else was. But from the first year, he certainly knew I was gay. I suspect one or two others thought I was, but never mentioned it. And it wasn't really until my third year, and even more my first year as a postgraduate, that I felt more relaxed in myself and able to talk about my sexuality. And by the time I left, I first of all went into a teaching job. I think there was a small group of people, intimate friends, who knew I was gay. But the crucial thing you've got to remember about the 60s was that it was still a period where everyone lived in the closet. However open they may be in small supportive circles, no one readily talked about their queer sexuality. It just wasn't something you did. By the late 60s, things were changing a lot, because the law changed, of course, in 1967, and I think that emboldened many people of my generation to be more open. By that time, people knew me well enough, and I felt more confident in talking to them. But really, I was not out in any real sense. I was out to myself, I was out to a small group of people, but I wasn't out to the world. That came later. I didn't formally come out to my parents until 1972. And their basic position was, we love you, and because of that we'll accept who you are, but we rather you didn't talk about it. And that, certainly during my father's lifetime, I never did talk about it again with him. And I learned much later that I assumed he would tell everyone in the family. My mother knew, of course. She knew at the same time as my father. But I discovered years later that neither my mother nor my father had ever talked to my brothers about it. And I'm not sure whether that was protecting me or protecting them. Eventually that did change, but it took a long time. And I saw one of my brothers recently, and we were talking about this, and he said no one had ever mentioned until he was in his late teens that I was gay. He suspected, because I'd come home with men. and you know, I was ostensibly single, the usual thing. But as far as he was concerned, this was an area that no one talked about. And because my father had asked me not to talk about it, I didn't feel free to talk to my brothers until much later. So again, I was out to the world. I was well known as a queer academic by the 1980s. I had a number of books. By that time, I had a senior academic job. So the world officially knew I was gay, but I couldn't talk to my family easily about it. And that was partly my barriers, but also their barriers. The fences were up until considerably later. And again, that I found to be true of a number of people of my generation. So the whole process of coming out is not a single act, and you're out and you're out. It's a continual process which takes up the rest of your life, actually. It's very interesting because years later, I interviewed a large number of older gay men and for a project, and discovered that a number of them had lived in this sort of area and were active at this period when I was a student, active in presumably cruising and so on. But of course I never knew them. And that brought home to me subsequently how people lived side by side, but we never knew what was going on really. I certainly didn't have an active sex life in Bloomsbury at all. I came into digs in East Finchley when I first came to London, and sharing a house with the owners of the house and a couple of other students. And it was almost like a family. They fed you and washed your clothes and so on. It's quite cosy, quite nice. A bit difficult if you're anxious to explore your sexuality. But for the first 2 years, I lived there. So my base outside the college during the day was East Finchley, which isn't a red hot place. But inevitably, I discovered that there was all sorts of queer networks around there. I did actually meet people in East Finchley on walks in parks and so on. And they were some of the friends I built up over the years. And of course, it was easy to move around in London. So I started going to pubs like the William IV in Hampstead, and pubs in central London. There weren't a huge number of them, but they certainly existed. There was a queer scene, but it's much more discreet and closeted than it became in the 80s and 90s. The point was there were no gay societies anywhere. There was the Homosexual Law Reform Society, which was based here in London, which was essentially run by gay men, but was officially a straight organisation campaigning for human rights for those poor, benighted others out there. And it wasn't until gay liberation in 1970 that a whole network of gay societies were established, especially in colleges. So ULU had a gay soc, for instance. LSE had a gay soc, which I was involved in because I was working there by then. Although it was called the Gay Culture Society, not Gay Soc. So there were networks. Quite honestly, I can't remember if UCL had a gay soc in those early days. It probably did. But ULU's just across the road, so easy to go there. Interestingly, I didn't tend to go to Soho that often. I went to Earl's Court and I went to other gay bars around London. So Soho has never been my haunt. And by the time it exploded into a new life in the late 80s, early 90s, I'd stopped basically going to bars. But just to give you a sense of the history, the first thing that happened was that gay bars began to become more open. I remember going to Liverpool sometime in the mid-70s and had a list from Spartacus, Gay Guide, which then was the main way of finding your way around the world. I went to with my partner. We went to a gay bar in Liverpool, and at that stage the windows were all blackened, boarded up, all black glass. You couldn't see what was going on, and you had to knock on the door to enter. And there was a little grill, and someone would say, "Do you want to come in? You know that this is a gay bar," and that's how bars were outside London until way into the 80s. So although there was an explosion of bars, as I've suggested, they were still in many places outside London very discreet, very closeted. But the other thing that happened from the 1970s on was the emergence of mega clubs. And self-organised discos as well. But Heaven, for instance, began in the second half of the 70s. Claimed to be the biggest gay bar in the world at one stage. Others around North London, Bang, and so on. These were the first mega discos. And by the late 70s, hundreds, they were largely men actually, large numbers, hundreds, even thousands on some occasion, were going to these discos. And there was very much a disco culture which was very much influenced by gay things, gay music, gay-orientated music. By the 80s, I think the gay scene was beginning to get a bit more sophisticated. So you'd get cafes as well as bars. You'd get bars that were more welcoming of women, especially in London areas. It became a much more, I was going to say integrated, but a much more ordinary scene. It wasn't so hidden behind dark windows or didn't have grills on the door. It was much more open, and there seemed to be a much greater era of toleration. So by the 1980s, Soho, which had always had various gay things, but was largely seen as a haunt of female prostitutes and sleazy activities. By the late 80s, early 90s, it had quite a flourishing open gay scene, and that's remained ever since, with much more open bars and so on, everywhere, and restaurants and so on. And people began to move in. Lesbians and gays began to move in to the cheaper rents in Soho. Not so cheap anymore. But it became much more a gay village, as other parts of the country, like Manchester's village, were doing at the same time. So it was very much like the American model of tending to have all gay facilities, bars, hairdressers, and bookshops, saunas, all in the same area. So Soho was beginning to develop a bit like that, as the village in Manchester, parts of Edinburgh and so on. And that was very much a product of the 80s and early 90s. The paradox was that this was the period of greatest threat to the LGBT community because of AIDS. So there's this paradox that there was like an existential threat to our existence, to our very lives through AIDS. And at the same time, there was this increasingly flourishing gay scene. The odd thing was, I was a highly political person throughout the 60s. I came from a Labour tradition in South Wales, and I joined the Labour Society when I started at UCL. So I was certainly identified as on the left. The left wasn't identified with sexual politics in any real sense. In fact, many people on the left were extremely hostile to what later became known as gay rights. They just thought it a diversion, wasn't about class, wasn't about poverty, you know, so why should they be bothered? So my political education in the 60s, I became more and more radicalised, as lots of people did, but it wasn't associated with sexuality at all. And one of the great things about gay liberation was that it sought very much to bring together left-wing position, revolutionary tradition, in fact, as we saw it at the time, with the idea of radical sexual transformation as well. And one of the things about GLF which certainly influenced me was that it brought those two things together. You could be on the left and you could be openly gay or lesbian. And in fact, a major task which I was involved in the early 70s was to try to bring together those two things. I became involved with a journal called Gay Left, which is precisely an attempt to influence Marxism through gay liberation and influence gay liberation through Marxism and socialist traditions. And we worked together through the 70s, a group of us, to do that, and published this magazine and a book and so on. So that for me was a major radicalizing influence. And it began me writing, in fact, because at that stage I'd only just got my MPhil, I hadn't got my PhD at that stage. I was scrabbling around looking for an academic job, and eventually I got a research assistantship at LSE. Now that's important because Gay Liberation Front started at LSE in October 1970. I started working at LSE at the beginning of October 1970. So there was a happy conjunction of my career and the emergence of a sexual politics I could identify with. But after the research assistantship finished, it went on for years actually, but after it finished I couldn't get a job. So by that stage I'd written 2 books, but I couldn't get an academic job because the books were about homosexuality or about socialism. I did one on socialism and the other on gay politics. This was 1977. And once the research assistantship came to an end, I couldn't get a job in academia. So I spent a year on the dole, writing another book as it happened. And then I managed to get another research post at Essex University. And that's when I made the crucial switch in my career from history to sociology. Because sociologists were willing to employ an out queer and someone who wrote about gay things, whereas history departments were not. And I mean, to this day actually, the UCL history department has never asked me back to give a paper, although I've given papers all around the world, lectures and papers. UCL history department has never. Now I'm not saying that simply because I'm gay, but it shows some of the issues. UCL history was quite conservative with a small c in many ways, both in structure of the degree and range of interest talked about. And there was no notion at that stage that you could study sexuality or queer studies or feminist studies or whatever. It just wasn't on the agenda. So we're talking about a period of deep freeze, really, in terms of what academia could offer. So for someone like me, and many others in my generation, who were highly trained as historians, and eventually did quite well in the profession, or parallel professions, in the 70s it was extremely difficult. So I had a period of unemployment in the mid-70s, and then I had a period of unemployment again in the turn of the decade, in 1980, where it was very difficult to get jobs. So my first full-time academic job was as a professor, a full professor, and in a sociology department. not a history department. I don't think I was blacklisted. I don't think there was anything conscious in we mustn't employ this guy or others like me. It was more, what is this guy writing about the history of homosexuality got to do with the history degree I'm running? There was a feeling of displacement. You were an odd guy. So although my first book was called Coming Out, and was about the history of the gay movement in Britain from the 19th century. And a load was well received, reviewed widely, historians approved, some historians liked it, and it's still in print actually after all these years. Despite the fact that I was recognised as someone who achieved high levels of scholarship, they didn't want me. And that's still true for many people who write on the margins of what's respectable. A little anecdote about that is that sometime in the early 1980s, a friend of mine called the book up at the British Library. And when it arrived, she had to move to the part of the library, it was then the North Library, where you read under supervision. And this was where you were allowed to read pornographic books. So my book was regarded as semi-pornographic by the British Library, of all things, up to the 1980s. Now, an interesting element of that is one of the set pieces in the book itself describes how the pioneering campaigner for homosexual rights, Edward Carpenter, had led a campaign just before the First World War for what was then the British Museum Library, precisely to allow access to books like his. And, you know, I was jokey about it. This couldn't happen anymore. It happened to me, and I'm sure it happened to lots of others. That's just an indication of the sort of climate which still persisted into the 80s. And of course that was accentuated after 1981 by the AIDS crisis, which led to a real backlash. So there was this period in the 70s when things apparently opened up. But when it came to the crunch, they didn't open that much, especially if you were trying to break through in subject areas and writing about sex and sexuality and homosexuality. I wouldn't say I was particularly a leading light. I was one of the first few dozen who went along to meetings. And in the early stages, it was all about mass meetings, people standing up and orating, which wasn't my style at all. So what I did was to get involved in some of the smaller groups which began emerging. So I was involved in something called the counter-psychiatry group. Then I was involved in a group that wrote pamphlets, gay liberation pamphlets. And then I got involved in Gay Left, and that took up most of the rest of the 70s. So I went to mass meetings, I went on demos, but I wouldn't say I was a leading light in the sense I was a leader, but I was a pioneer. I was there, and that's been crucial to my life. In terms of my lifespan and many of my generation, I think involvement in gay liberation was the most important event in our lives. And it's a whole series of reasons for that. I think the first thing was that it was based on the assumption that we had nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of. We were gay and that was a fact and you should accept it. So it was no longer apologetic, it was no longer saying we must be discreet. It was about being open, it was about being loud, about being proud. And that was very important because someone like me who'd been sexually active in the 60s but no one knew except a small circle of friends. After 1970 I was quite proud to declare I was gay in all sorts of ways. Coming out, in other words, was the crucial element in the early 70s. And I think, looking back, that's been the most crucial thing about the whole gay liberation experience. The fact that we're much more open about it has been a crucial element in beginning to dissolve the cement that held prejudice in place. Because once people began realizing that their fathers, their mothers, their brothers, their sisters, their kids, their aunts and uncles were potentially gay or lesbian, or bi or trans, those are crucial, I think, in beginning to change public opinion. But it was a long process. In the early 70s, and this is the second thing that's important about gay liberation, we believed, in a sense, it was a revolutionary movement and things would change very rapidly. I think we soon learned that things don't change rapidly. What did change rapidly was our sense of pride, our sense of confidence, which is crucial to everything else. But very soon there was a backlash developing. Almost immediately a backlash developed. And by the 1980s, that was in full swell in America and in Britain, Australia, all around. And that was because of the eruption of the AIDS epidemic. The third crucial thing that, for me at least, was very important was that I met my first long-term lover. And that was transformative for me in allowing me to integrate all aspects of my life. I'd had sexual partners in the 60s, never very long-lasting. And I felt, in a way, that sex and life were two separate things. They could run in parallel, but they weren't necessarily integrated. What having a partner did was to bring them all together. We were both openly gay together. We'd go round arm in arm. We were involved in the gay movement together. We lived together. It was absolutely transformative for me. And many of my generation again similarly got involved with people. In some cases, these relationships have lasted till now. In other cases, there may have only been a few years or whatever. I was with my partner for 9 or 10 years, but we remained friends until his death, 25 years ago. So it was a lifetime experience, and that was true of so many people that I was involved with, women and men. So I think that personal thing was absolutely crucial. So that it worked on several different levels, gay liberation. It worked on the level of the great expanse of politics and how you saw yourself in a public way, and being out was crucial to that. But it was also about your personal confidence and your ability to develop intimate, loving relationships on the basis of equality. We were very committed to having equal relationships and struggling to realise that. Some people lived in communes as an attempt to get away from the traditional division of labour. Others remained long-term single. All my life, in one way or another, I've been involved in relationships, and that's been absolutely crucial to my life. Well, the very first demo was in Highbury Fields in Islington, and that was in late November 1970. And it was the very first openly gay demo. There's only a couple of hundred of us, and we trudged around Highbury Fields with banners and so on, and then got on the tube and went home. So it was a slightly odd experience. It was done deliberately to proclaim that we were here, we were proud, and so on. There was a short notice in the Times the next day. It was a Friday night, and the Times on Saturday had a small notice. And that was written by one of the people who'd been on the demo, who happened Andrew Lumsden, who happened to work for the Times at that point. So it became public fairly soon. But it was, for those of us involved, it was almost a euphoric experience because numbers grew week by week for the weekly meetings. First of all at LSE, then in Covent Garden, and then in Notting Hill. So the meetings grew from a few dozen to a few scores to a few hundred, and then several hundred. And it was at that point, by roughly 1972, that the whole thing became top-heavy. And instead of a single movement, it began to fragment's the wrong word, it began to multiply in different directions. All sorts of different groups began to emerge. And it also transformed the gay scene, because that had existed from time immemorial. There were always gay bars and clubs, fairly discreet, even saunas, for men, certainly, less for women. But the existence of a mass movement of gay men and lesbians sort of stimulated the development of a much more open gay scene. You've got to remember, though, that what 1967 did, the Sexual Offences Act, which decriminalised male homosexuality if you're over 21, was actually very restrictive in many ways. And it made very clear that homosexuality between men was only legal if it was done in private, which meant only two people present. So that was seen in the beginning as excluding the possibility of gay clubs, and efforts to establish more gay clubs were thwarted for the first couple of years. But once people began doing it and realised the sky didn't fall in, although there were regular police raids, but you could go on doing it, a new momentum began to develop, and that changed the nature of the traditional gay scene, which began to flourish in a new way, and backed, of course, by the emergence of new media. There'd been some gay magazines before, but there was small circulation, difficult to find them they were not on sale in stores or anything. The establishment of gay news in 1972, which came out of gay liberation, was pretty critical, because apart from news and stories and advice and the usual sort of thing, and culture pages, it also had long listings about the gay scene throughout the UK. So people, if they got hold of it, could begin to find out that they weren't alone, that there was, and they weren't destined to a life of isolation. There were hundreds, even thousands of venues throughout the UK, mainly in London and Manchester, one or two other cities, but also in the most obscure places, actually. And of course, support groups, helplines, Switchboard was founded at that period. There was a whole explosion of the gay world, really, which made it much easier to be gay. But at the same time as all this was developing, almost by reaction to it, and in many cases a deliberate reaction, you begin to see the elements of a backlash. There was already quite an energetic, conservative, morally conservative set of campaigns. Mary Whitehouse, for instance, something called the Festival of Light, which is an evangelical Christian organisation campaigning against pornography. And people involved in that began to be quite homophobic in their responses. And that current became more prominent as the 70s went on. And the country began to move in a conservative direction. The rise of Margaret Thatcher with a very conservative moral agenda, and then fading into the AIDS crisis during the 1980s. There was a much more conscious backlash against the lesbian and gay movement. But that then paradoxically produced a greater activism amongst the LGBT community by the end of the 1980s. So it's not a straight line. There were ups and downs in this process. And of course there were new generations coming on. So my generation in the 70s, many of us have continued doing various things since, but many others faded into private life and new generations came on. So by the early 1980s, for instance, there emerged an energetic black gay movement with a new generation of people, perhaps 10 years, 15 years younger than me. And I got to know the people involved there. And then from the mid-80s, you see the emergence of AIDS activists who've come through the movement, but we're now focusing on the AIDS struggle. And by the end of the 1980s, you begin to see the emergence of a new queer activism. When I first came out in the 60s, we all called ourselves queer, but it was very much using the word, the term of the enemy, of the homophobe, and internalising it. So it was a term of self-hatred. So when we got involved in gay liberation, and we began using the word gay, and later gay and lesbian, that was like a liberation, because we were rejecting the language of the oppressor and expressing our own term. And so for my generation, gay was a very important term and associated with coming out and with activism and so on. By the late 80s, a new generation again thought that many of my generation had become too conservative, too concerned with legal changes and not enough with cultural and social revolution. So queer activists re-emerged, this time using the language of the weird rejected as a positive term. And that, of course, is still an important current. So that, again, there isn't a straight history or a straight line. It's a very complex process. And when people today reject the word gay as being an offensive, old-fashioned word, that's precisely with what we were doing in my generation, rejecting the term queer as it had been used in the 50s and 60s. And many people who used the word gay in 1970 also rejected the word homosexual. So language has always been a very sensitive aspect of sexual politics. And today you get the same battles over trans issues. It's a battle about language as much as anything else. I'm happy to call myself queer now, it doesn't matter. And I even write articles with queer in the title. So it's not a big issue for me. But I know for many people in my generation, it is a big issue. I think the issues have changed radically. Our main concern in the 70s was through coming out and all the other activities I've described to affirm our identities, to say this is who we are, this has social and cultural elements and commitments, but it also is about us, it's about who we are, our sense of pride in ourselves, our rejection of guilt and shame, and our freedom to form relationships. So identity was a crucial issue. I think one of the interesting things about LGBTQ politics today is that it challenges the roots of all identities in many ways. Although slightly paradoxically, it rejects identity but affirms identities. But the identities have become much more micro identities. So you can have identities around your gender in a way that wasn't so true then, around your sexuality, so you can specify your specific sexual tastes. You know, if you're into BDSM, you can affirm your existence as a BDSM gay or lesbian or straight or whatever. So there's a sort of micro development of identity. So identity is still very much an issue, but the way identity is developed is that the big macro identities, which we assumed in the early 1970s as gay, lesbian, or later as queer, don't seem so significant today. And the very fact we now say LGBTQ, or whatever, shows that there's been a fragmentation. At the same time as the very fact we list them all together suggests we can work together. It's perhaps a long-winded message, but it's, first of all, I think it's important to recognise how far we have come since the 1960s. And it's not because of the benevolence of governments, it's actually because of the self-activity of LGBT people themselves. So to an extraordinary degree, our future is in our hands. The second thing to say is some of the changes in recent years have been controversial and divisive, and the whole issue of same-sex marriage was that. And now today, issues around trans are often divisive. And there are lots of other issues like how the language we use, the terms we use, the politics we have relate to minority populations, the significance of religion and so on. All these are current issues. But again, it seems to me that it's important that we continue a dialogue between each other on all these issues. In some cases, there's never an absolute right and an absolute wrong. And it's important to find ways of communicating with people we identify with and who identify with us, but where there are problems. The third thing is, despite all the gains, which I think are tremendous, there are still remaining problems. And I think that's true of any emerging group. I'm very involved in them at the moment with working with older LGBT plus people in an organisation called Opening Doors London, which is a support organisation, campaigning group, a charity that tries to support older LGBT people in a variety of different ways. But yesterday I was talking to someone who's involved with working with young trans people. There are groups for people with particular illness conditions. There's the whole campaign against bullying in schools. There's the campaign to improve the Gender Recognition Act. There are a whole series of different struggles, and it's important just to emphasize that in the world we live in any possible world, there will always be new issues coming up, and it's important to confront those issues and not think this is where we've reached, this is paradise and we needn't do anything more. So again, it's the issue of recognizing the importance of being alive to new problems, new contradictions that come up all the time. And that to me is what politics is about. It's not any longer, as I believed in the 70s, about a big bang transformation where everything would be wonderful. It's more a recognition that all the time, and living in the world we do, with all its conflicts and contradictions, there'll always be issues we have to confront. And the key thing in confronting those issues is that we believe in ourselves, that we recognise that nothing's going to happen unless we take the lead in making those things happen. So grassroots politics and grassroots activism continues to be important.